The stars remembered what the living tried to forget. Entire worlds had burned when the Empire came for Earth, oceans had boiled, forests had turned to black ash, and the last breath of a billion voices had been silenced beneath fire and steel. For centuries, the story of humanity was whispered as nothing more than a cautionary tale, the memory of a reckless species too dangerous to be allowed a future. The archives of the conquerors recorded humanity as extinct, its ashes scattered to the winds of the galaxy, its name erased from treaties, its history sealed away in vaults where no one dared look. Yet the archives were wrong, and the conquerors had overlooked something that did not die with cities or soldiers. They had overlooked one man. In the depths of the Kaldar prison moons, a forgotten facility carved into stone older than the stars themselves, there sat a human. Frail, bent, clothed in threadbare garments that looked centuries out of place, he was guarded not because he posed a threat but because he was considered a curiosity. The wardens called him the librarian. To them it was a joke, a reminder of how far humanity had fallen, from starships that once roamed the void to a single, broken scholar who carried books in his mind instead of weapons in his hands. They did not know what he truly carried. The Galactic Empire that ruled in cruelty believed knowledge belonged to them, controlled, edited, and verified until no dangerous ideas remained. To them, history was a weapon and stories were chains, carefully bent to ensure obedience. But the human librarian was older than their empire, and the words he remembered were not chains. They were sparks. He was taken from his cell only when officials grew bored. Captains and governors would summon him like a sideshow exhibit, asking him to speak of Earth, expecting tales of savagery and failure to confirm their superiority. Sometimes he remained silent, sometimes he spoke of rivers wider than cities, skies filled with birds that no fleet could blot out, songs that rose from 1,000 tongues in harmony. The aliens laughed at his fables, mocking the weakness of a species that clung to poetry instead of weapons. Yet in the silence that followed, some among them found themselves haunted. They dreamed of blue skies they had never seen, of warmth they had never felt. One such dreamer was Kalen, a young scribe of the Kaldar, tasked with recording prisoner transfers. He had never seen Earth, he had never seen a human before, yet something in the old man's words stirred inside him. When the librarian described the final library of Alexandria burning, Kalen felt shame. When he spoke of explorers crossing seas of darkness to touch unknown shores, Kalen felt longing. And when he whispered of mothers holding their children in the last moments of Earth, Kalen felt grief so raw it left him shaking. Kalen should have turned away, should have erased those words as the Empire demanded, but instead he wrote them down. The records were meant for ash, but Kalen hid them. At first it was only a few lines, then pages, then entire nights spent writing feverishly under the dim glow of forbidden candles. And so the words of Earth began to leak from the cracks of a prison moon into the veins of a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to feel. What Kalen did not know was that the librarian had chosen him. The old man had seen the doubt in his eyes, had recognized the hunger behind his questions, and so he fed him fragments. A myth here, a memory there, a parable cloaked in poetry that could pass as nonsense to his captors. But to Kalen, they were keys opening doors he never knew existed. One night, as storm winds howled across the barren surface of the prison moon, Kalen dared to ask the question that burned in him. Why do you tell me these things? They are dangerous, they are forbidden, they could kill us both. The librarian's eyes, clouded with age yet sharp as a blade honed for centuries, fixed upon him. Because you asked, that is enough. Those 4 words shook Kalen more than all the decrees of his empire. In his world, questions were treason, curiosity was a disease. Yet here was a man who claimed that a single question was worth risking death. Kalen returned to his quarters and could not sleep, because in his heart a spark had been lit. Elsewhere in the galaxy, shadows stirred. The Empire had grown fat and arrogant, confident in the silence of crushed civilizations, yet rumors of rebellion were beginning to spread. Whispers of hidden human survivors, whispers of ancient weapons left buried, whispers of a ghost who carried the lost knowledge of Earth. At first the rulers ignored them, but when pockets of resistance began quoting words that could only have come from human history, they turned their gaze toward the prison moons. The librarian knew this day would come. He had waited lifetimes for it. He had guarded his words carefully, releasing them like seeds into the right soil, and now those seeds had begun to grow in secret gardens across the stars. He did not need weapons or armies. He needed only listeners, and once they listened, they could never forget. On the anniversary of Earth's fall, the Empire staged a grand execution. They dragged prisoners from across the sectors, rebels, traitors, dreamers, and they lined them up to die beneath the burning suns. The librarian was among them, his frail body pushed forward by armored soldiers who expected nothing more than another corpse for their spectacle. But as he walked, the crowd stirred, not with laughter, not with jeers, but with whispers. Some called him by name, though they had never met him. Others carried fragments of his stories written on scraps of cloth, and when he mounted the execution platform, 1,000 voices murmured words the Empire had tried to erase. Kalen stood among them, trembling. He had carried the words into the crowd himself, and now he watched as the old man, chains on his wrists, lifted his head toward the sky as if he saw Earth still shining among the stars. The executioner raised his blade, but in that moment the librarian began to speak. Not in a shout, not in defiance, but in the calm, steady voice of a man telling a story that must be told. Once there was a species that refused to kneel. They burned, but they did not vanish. They bled, but their blood became ink. And even when their world turned to ash, their stories walked on. The executioner hesitated. The crowd leaned forward. Kalen's heart pounded. Across the galaxy, unseen listeners felt the tremor ripple through the web of silence. The Empire had tried to erase humanity, but here was proof they had failed. Because stories, once spoken, could not be killed. And so, on a forgotten moon under the eyes of an empire, the last librarian of Earth began the tale that would set the stars on fire. The execution was meant to end with silence, but silence never came. The blade hovered above the librarian's neck, trembling in the hands of a soldier who no longer believed in his orders. Around him, the crowd surged with restless whispers, voices layering upon voices until the murmurs became a current, and the current became a tide. The overseer barked commands, yet his words were drowned by the spreading chorus. They were not cries of anger or battle, but something far more dangerous. They were stories. It began with Kalen, his voice breaking as he repeated the words the librarian had taught him. Once there was a species that refused to kneel. Someone beside him echoed it. Then another. Soon the execution square filled with thousands chanting in unison, their rhythm shaking the stones beneath their feet. Soldiers hesitated. They had trained to fight blades, bombs, and rebels screaming war, but they had never been taught how to kill a story. The overseer snarled and gave the order. But before the blade could fall, the crowd surged forward. Chains snapped, soldiers fell, and in the chaos the librarian was pulled from the platform not by strength but by the tide of his listeners. They shielded him with their bodies, carried him through alleys, smuggled him into tunnels where the Empire's eyes could not follow. That night, the prison moon did not sleep. Words burned brighter than fire, painted across walls, carved into stone, whispered to children until every corridor echoed with the memory of Earth. By dawn, the Empire's censors arrived. They erased recordings, executed witnesses, sealed off districts. But it was too late. The words had slipped free, passed from mouth to mouth, faster than soldiers could silence them. In taverns of distant spaceports, smugglers told the tale of a frail human who spoke with the voice of eternity. In academies, students secretly scribbled his parables into notebooks and shared them beneath desks. And in the darkest corners of the Empire, where despair had long strangled hope, resistance cells whispered, "The librarian lives." The Empire panicked. They declared humanity a plague of memory, a virus of thought that had to be purged. Anyone repeating human words was branded a traitor. Ships patrolled trade routes, seizing books and scrolls, hunting for Kalen and his companions who had vanished into the void. Yet the more they tried to silence the words, the louder they grew. Kalen had not planned to become a fugitive. He had been a scribe, quiet, unnoticed. But now he carried not only his own notes but entire fragments of Earth's history carved into crystal slates and hidden within his cloak. He traveled with the librarian through shadow networks of smugglers and sympathetic worlds, and everywhere they went, they left stories behind. Sometimes it was a simple phrase scratched into a wall. Sometimes it was a parable told to a gathering of workers during their rest cycle. And sometimes it was only silence, the silence of a man sitting among strangers until curiosity broke them and they asked a question. And always the librarian answered, for one question was enough. Kalen began to notice how different species reacted. The Thalori, insectoid and bred for obedience, trembled when they first heard the librarian speak, then slowly raised their heads as though remembering what freedom felt like. The Vera, amphibious traders who had long worshipped profit above all else, found themselves crying when they heard stories of Earth mothers sacrificing everything for their children. The Krav, cowering warriors who respected only strength, grew silent when told of human explorers who ventured into the void not for conquest but for wonder. Each species believed themselves immune, yet each carried home something new in their hearts, something the Empire could not extract. The librarian never claimed to lead. He never called for armies or battles. He only spoke, yet the galaxy began to change around him. A rebellion did not rise with banners and war cries, but with ideas whispered in the dark. Soldiers began questioning their orders. Scholars began unsealing forbidden archives. Merchants rerouted their ships to carry not weapons but words. And still the Empire did not understand, for they believed power lay only in fleets and thrones. They did not see that power could also lie in memory. In the great halls of the Imperial Council, rulers shouted over one another. Some demanded the librarian's death, others called him a fraud, still others dismissed him as a myth. But fear bled through their denials. If one human's words could shake their grip on the stars, what would happen if more humans remained hidden? The thought haunted them like a shadow they could not dispel. Meanwhile, Kalen began to change. He had once been a recorder of orders, but now he found himself speaking when the librarian remained silent. In a mining colony, when workers begged for a story, the old man only smiled and gestured to Kalen. At first his voice shook, but then he remembered the cadence, the rhythm, the pulse of Earth's memory. He spoke of the first human flight into the sky, of fragile wings defying gravity. The workers wept, and when Kalen finished, he realized he had become more than a scribe. He had become a carrier. The librarian watched with quiet satisfaction. He knew his time was not infinite. His body was failing. His voice sometimes faltered, but that did not matter. He had never meant to be the last librarian forever. He had meant to be the first spark of many. Yet the Empire was not blind forever. Their hunters grew sharper, their traps tighter. One evening on a forgotten world where mountains pierced the clouds, Kalen and the librarian were cornered. Soldiers surrounded them, weapons gleaming, and the commander sneered. "Your words end here, old man. Stories cannot stop plasma." The librarian did not resist. He only looked at Kalen and whispered, "Then tell them a story." Kalen's heart thundered. The soldiers raised their rifles. And with no weapon but his voice, Kalen began to speak. He spoke of the fall of Earth, of cities drowned in fire, of children carried into the void, of a people who chose to fight not because they believed they would win but because they refused to vanish in silence. His words echoed off the cliffs, carried by the wind. The soldiers hesitated, some lowered their weapons, one fell to his knees, chairs burning in eyes that had not known tears since childhood. The commander screamed for obedience, but the line had already broken. The soldiers scattered, torn between fear of their masters and the pull of something deeper, something older than the Empire itself. They fled into the mountains, leaving the librarian and Kalen alone beneath the stars. That night, Kalen asked the question he had never dared. "Why do your stories change them? Why do they change me?" The librarian closed his eyes, breathing shallowly. "Because stories are what make us human. And humanity is what the Empire fears most. They can crush armies, burn worlds, erase names, but they cannot kill what is remembered. They cannot kill what is carried." Kalen did not sleep. He wrote until his hands bled, until every word was carved into memory so deep it could never be stolen. And somewhere in the distance, across worlds and systems, the first flames of rebellion erupted, lit not by armies, but by stories whispered by a dying librarian and carried by a boy who had once been nothing more than a scribe. The Empire had thought humanity extinct, but humanity was returning, not with fleets of ships or superweapons, but with words sharp enough to pierce the heart of empires. And in the silence between the stars, rulers began to tremble. The council chamber burned with voices, alien delegates shouting across marble walls carved from worlds older than Earth itself. They had listened in silence at first, entertained even, as the frail librarian told his stories. But silence had turned into unease, and unease into open fear. Every story he told reached deeper into the cracks of their empires. He spoke of fallen kings who had drowned their people in greed, of merchants who chained themselves to gold until they starved, of gods who demanded worship but fell silent in their own despair. He never raised his voice, never pleaded. He only told stories, and somehow, the stories did not remain mere words. They lingered like smoke in the lungs of every listener, igniting sparks of doubt in hearts that had never questioned themselves before. The Supreme Chancellor of the Ilyari Empire rose, her crystalline armor catching the light of twin suns outside the chamber dome. She was old by alien reckoning, her reign unbroken for centuries. Her voice was iron. This cannot continue. You call this human harmless, but he is more dangerous than fleets. He infects thought itself. Look at my ministers. Already they whisper, already they hesitate. He must be silenced, erased, as Earth was erased. A murmur rippled through the chamber. But then another voice, low but steady, rose against hers. It was the envoy of the Turlik, a species that had once conquered half the spiral arm before turning inward in collapse. His yellow eyes burned. He does not infect. He reminds. The truths he speaks are the truths our histories buried. My ancestors silenced their own thinkers, and their empire rotted from within. If a single human can make us see what we fear, then perhaps the problem is not the man but what we have become. The librarian sat quietly, his thin hands folded on his lap. He did not smile, but his eyes glimmered with something that looked like sorrow. He had seen this play before. Empires, always proud, always afraid of their own shadows. He knew the choice they would face: bury the truth once more, or face it and change. Both paths demanded pain. One of the younger delegates, a silver-skinned heir from the Merchant Confederacy, leaned forward. Her voice trembled with anger and awe. You, human, why do you speak of kings and wars and betrayals as though they are ours? They are not. They are your Earth stories. What did they matter to us? The librarian lifted his gaze to her. His voice carried no weight, yet it reached every corner of the chamber. Because stories are not bound by soil. They live where ears will hear them. Your people trade metals and spice across stars, but you have forgotten that the greatest trade is in ideas. What I carry are not my people's alone. They are yours now. What you do with them will shape you more than all your fleets. The chamber fell into silence. Even the Chancellor lowered her gaze for a moment. In that pause, something irreversible happened. Delegates who had sat unmoved for centuries felt the tremor of possibility. And it terrified them. The Chancellor slammed her staff against the floor. Enough. Guards, take him. Break his tongue if you must. He is too dangerous. Armored soldiers advanced, weapons humming. Yet none of the delegates moved to stop them, until a sound pierced the chamber. Not the librarian's voice, but dozens more. Delegates themselves, rising, repeating his words. Fragments of his stories, spoken in alien tongues, carried across the hall. A merchant repeating the tale of the miser king. A warrior whispering the story of the god who fell. They did not even realize they were doing it. His words had become theirs. The guards hesitated. They had no command against this. The librarian closed his eyes. He had always known his end might come like this, not with triumph but with a seed planted. And that was enough, for seeds grow where soil is ready. The Chancellor shouted again, her voice shrill with fear. But now she was drowned out, not by rebellion, not by violence, but by stories. The chamber filled with them, echoes upon echoes, spreading like a tide. The guards lowered their weapons, uncertain. And in that moment, the librarian finally spoke once more. You sought to erase Earth. You succeeded in ash and blood. But Earth was never land or stone or even flesh. Earth was memory. Earth was story, and stories cannot be burned. The soldiers did not touch him. The Chancellor fled the chamber, her authority shattered. The galaxy had witnessed something it did not yet understand. A frail human, unarmed, had turned the machinery of power not with force, but with words. In the years that followed, they called it the turning. Empires that once ruled through fear found themselves questioned by their own citizens. Merchant guilds revised their laws, warriors set down arms, scholars demanded histories long hidden. The galaxy trembled, not with the roar of fleets but with the quiet of ideas reshaping themselves. And as for the librarian, his body did not last long in alien prisons. He was old, frail, mortal, but his words had already escaped him, carried on tongues that did not know they were spreading a revolution. He died quietly, no monument, no fleet in his honor. But in alien markets, in warrior barracks, in council chambers, his stories lived. Generations later, children of worlds that had once enslaved humans sat around fires or beneath starlit domes, telling tales of kings who fell to their greed, of warriors who found honor in mercy, of gods who vanished when forgotten. They did not know the man's name. They called him only what he had been, the last librarian of Earth. And somewhere, in the silence between stars, it was enough.